Welcome to the East Asia by Rhoads Murphey chapter summary podcast at the Historian's Eye. Please subscribe, and if you'd like to be notified when new episodes appear, click the bell icon. Chapter 10, Premodern Vietnam. Section 1, Introduction. Until modern times, Vietnam was divided into different regions inhabited by various populations. The ancestors of the Vietnamese initially inhabited only the Red River Plain in what is now northern Vietnam. The Chams, a people linguistically related to the Malays, inhabited the central coast. Vietnamese domains began conquering and settling in these regions during the 15th century. The Mekong River Plain, the southernmost region, was Khmer territory until the 17th century. By the middle of the 18th century, Vietnamese rulers had successfully taken control of the area. From the early 17th century, two main Vietnamese states had emerged and were in conflict with each other. The border was in the same area as the early Cham Vietnamese border and the later demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel of the period between 1954 and 1975. Europeans writing about the region called the northern kingdom Tonkin and the southern Cochin China. The Vietnamese referred to the two countries as Dong Nguyen, or the outside region in the north, and Dong Trong in the south. Officially, rulers of the north called the state Dai Viet, or the Great Viet, and rulers in the south officially called the region Dai Nam, or the Great South. The founder of the Gaian dynasty, Gaian An, known as Emperor Gai Long, united the two rivaling kingdoms at the beginning of the 19th century. The name Vietnam was not commonly used until the rise of nationalism in the 20th century. The name Viet, Ua in Chinese, derives from the name of an ancient kingdom on the southernmost coast of China during the Warring States period, from the 6th to the 3rd centuries BCE. It was used by the ancient Chinese to refer to people inhabiting their southern frontier, and was evidently adopted by those people through their relationships with China. The French conquered the Mekong River Plain in the 1860s. They moved northwards and controlled the entire region by the 1890s. They divided the country into three regions. The region around the Mekong Delta was called Cochin China. The plain of the Red River in the north was called Tonkin. The narrow central coastal plain was named Annam, which comes from the Chinese word Annan, or pacified south. The French colonial terms Tonkinese, Annamese, and Cochin Chinese were later replaced with the contemporary Vietnamese. Nam Viet, or Nan Yue in Chinese, means Southern Viet, and was the name of an ancient kingdom in southern China. Using Chinese grammar, Nam Viet becomes Vietnam. Geography. The contemporary country of Vietnam is shaped like the letter S. It shares borders with China, Laos, and Cambodia. The terrain is very mountainous. The major agricultural and population centers are located in the north and south ends, in the plains of the Red and Mekong rivers. Mountains and the sea-enclosed lowlands in the north and center. The lands of the Mekong River Plain are often contested with Cambodia because there is no obvious geographical borders. Sparsely inhabited mountains that house various populations define Vietnam, particularly its border with China, Laos, and Cambodia. The Muong, who speak a language very close to Vietnamese, inhabit the midlands between the Red and Kha rivers. Several groups of people who speak languages that are related to Thai inhabit the northern area near the Chinese and North Laos borders. A group of people speaking languages related to Malay and Mon Khmer live in Vietnam's central highlands. The Sino-Vietnamese border is generally mountainous, and its line was established in the 11th and 13th centuries. Vietnam's geographical boundaries have changed throughout history and have been heavily influenced by domestic disputes and its relationship with foreigners like the Chinese, the Mongols, and the French. There are 5 periods of Vietnamese history. The first, prehistoric times until the Han conquest in the 1st century CE. The second is the 1st through the 10th centuries. Vietnam was part of the Chinese Empire until the 10th century. The third is the Vietnamese Buddhist Dynasties of Le and Tran from the 11th through the 14th century. The fourth, 15th through the 19th century include the Lei Dynasty, the rise of Confucianism, southward expansion, political turmoil, civil war, important developments in literature and religion, and increased contact with other parts of Asia and the West. And the fifth, French colonialism, the Cold War, and contemporary Vietnam. Cultural roots. Vietnamese is more akin to other Southeast Asian languages than Chinese, though the vocabulary of Vietnamese is currently 60% Chinese in origin. Classical Chinese was used as a primary written language for administration, law, scholarship, and literature from the Han times until the 12th century. Nam, an early form of written vernacular Vietnamese, was based on Chinese characters but was phonetic and semantic. Jesuit missionaries invented the Vietnamese alphabet in the 17th century. This replaced Chinese characters in the 20th century during the French colonial period and is now used universally. Early contact with China. Contact between China and early Vietnam occurred along the coast and overland through the Long Song passes and connect with the West River Valley in the southern Chinese province of Guangxi. During the Qin dynasty in China, thousands were sent by Emperor Qin Shi Huang to settle along the West River in southern China. The provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi. Zhao Tuo, an officer who settled in the region, declared himself king after the death of Shi Huang and named the kingdom Nan Yue. During the early 2nd century BCE, Zhao Tuo attempted to acquire the Red River Plain, which had previously been conquered by An Duang, who had arrived from the north previously during the Qin invasions and overthrown the king of a local group called the Hung. Zhao Tuo eventually defeated An Duang and assigned officers to oversee the region. Under the Han dynasty, Nan Yue was incorporated rather peacefully into the empire late in the 2nd century BCE. These changes in government control did not appear to have significantly affected the local culture and structure of governance, except in the areas where Han garrisons protected trading centers and settlements of northern immigrants. Han administration of Nan Yue. Han administrators attempted to register and tax local populations along imperial lines. In order to do this, they felt that the Vietnamese family system had to be reoriented according to the Chinese concept of patriarchal authority. But the non-immigrant population ruled by the local aristocracy rejected Han ideas, particularly regarding patrilocal marriage and private land ownership. In 40 CE, an uprising was led by the Trung sisters, who were daughters of local chieftains. It emerged in reaction to Han pressure to abandon matriarchal traditions and attitudes towards land ownership. They successfully forced the Han authorities out of the region for 2 years. Ma Yuan, a Han general, brought in an army along the coast and defeated the Trung sisters. The Han victory denotes a new era in Vietnamese history, where its territories became part of successive Chinese dynastic frontiers. Ma Yuan's conquest marks the end of Vietnam's prehistoric period and the beginning of its membership in the Chinese Empire. It is the beginning of a new emphasis on East Asian civilization. During the following period, the ancestors of modern Vietnamese inhabited the southernmost province of successive Chinese empires. Elite members of society were educated to view the empires as the center of civilization, and thus arguably forms the basis of Vietnamese culture as it is understood today. Section 2, belonging to the empire. Some historians have described the 1,000 years of northern domination as a period beginning with the Han conquest and lasting through the Trong domination, but it is also a period of much cultural interchange. Vietnamese response to the Chinese dynastic cycle. Vietnam developed its own cyclical response to the Chinese dynastic cycle. The provincial-style regional governments more or less accepted their role in the empire when dynasties were new and strong, only to reject them when dynasties weakened. When Chinese dynasties became too weak to maintain control over the region, local powers would emerge, often in competition with each other. Often imperial officers would become local Vietnamese rulers. Local Vietnamese tended to prefer the well-ordered imperial rule to the chaos and anarchy involved with rebellion. Therefore, uprisings tended to occur only when imperial power was too weak to maintain order, or in response to objectionable administrators. The two main historical illustrations of this are Vietnam's relationship with the Han and the Tang dynasties. Collapse of the Han Dynasty. As the power of the Han Dynasty weakened about 180, Shi Ji, who was a leader of a clan originally from Shandong Province in northern China, became a local Vietnamese governor. During his rule, from about 180 until his death in 226, he kept peace in the region. Later generations saw him as the father of Vietnamese education. He was known for providing refuge to scholars and monks who opened schools, built temples, and introduced Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. Collapse of the Tang Dynasty. As the Tang Dynasty declined in the late 9th century, a civil war broke out between those who supported and opposed the Tang. Under the leadership of General Gao Pian, the pro-Tang forces won in 865. He built the city known today as Hanoi, and his subordinates controlled the local government until the Tang garrisons were abandoned in 1880. Local clans who had made alliances with Gao Pian took control of the region and maintained peace until 930, when they were conquered by a local dynasty in southern China. Immigration, intermarriage, and acculturation. During the period between the Han and Tang dynasty, thousands of immigrants moved south into Vietnam and created a large immigrant community. New immigrants brought their cultural traditions with them as well as adapted to Vietnamese culture. The local language increasingly incorporated Chinese vocabulary. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism influenced traditional religion. Confucian studies developed to a level where a few local students traveled to the Chinese capital and took the civil service exams. As part of the empire, Vietnam acted as an important center for trade and military activity. In the period before the rise of Canton during the late Tang dynasty, it maintained the main imperial port for trade in Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean. Chinese dynasties concentrated on controlling the northern portions of Vietnam. The south remained in the hands of various groups, including the Chams and the Kingdom of Funan. The Chams. Along with other groups, the Chams inhabited the central highlands and spoke a language related to Malay. Their culture was directly influenced by interactions with India and Southeast Asia. Cham kingdoms appear along the central Vietnamese coast after invasions from the north. The frontier separating the Chams from the Chinese and Vietnamese was contentious for centuries. Ultimately, the Chams were pushed further south. The Funan Kingdom. The Chinese recorded the existence of a kingdom between the 3rd and 6th centuries that had been founded by a Brahmin from India. Its territory included portions of modern-day Cambodia and the Mekong Delta, as well as part of Thailand, northern Malay, and southern Burma. Eventually, the Khmers usurped its Mekong territory in the 9th century. In the 10th century, the Tang dynasty ended and the Chinese disintegrated into various conflicting kingdoms. The Cook clan ruled at Annam and patiently waited for a new dynasty to emerge in the north. But in 930, the Southern Han dynasty ruling Canton invaded the Red River Plain and forced the Cook ruler into exile. This marks the end of Vietnam's period of belonging to the empire and the beginning of a new relationship with the North, as well as the introduction of new elements into the Vietnamese society. In this millennium, the basic features of Vietnamese emerged. It was a period in which there was no sharp divide between China and Vietnam. Section 3. The Buddhist Dynasties. The transition from the Tang to the Song dynasty include two major changes that greatly affected Vietnam's relationship with China. The Song dynasty devalued the Han and Tan style of government by a martial aristocracy and shifted to a civil bureaucracy run by scholar officials. This resulted in the Song's inability to assert its direct authority over frontier regions. The Song and subsequently the Ming and Qing dynasties were less cosmopolitan than the Han and Tang dynasties, and Song rulers sought to define Vietnamese as a barbaric order. This resulted in increased resistance to the empire. The post-Tang period has been described as a time of disorder. Leaders of the Cuc clan in Vietnam successfully fought against the Southern Han in two major conflicts. In 930, the Southern Han Kingdom invaded Vietnam. In the south, the leader, Duong Dinh Nhi, expelled the northerners and took the title of emperor in 931. No Nguyen, Duong's son-in-law, ruled subsequently, and defeated a Southern Han fleet. He declared himself king, but his sons were not able to maintain power. Political power became fragmented into 12 lords, as 12 lords competed for authority. In the 960s, by the time that the Song dynasty had restored an empire in China, Dinh Bo Lin organized soldiers from the southern provinces, defeated the lords, and unified Vietnamese territory, declared himself emperor, and obtained titles of vassalage from the Song court. He ruled from the area located on the border between the Red River Plain and southern Muong provinces until he was assassinated in 979. His assassination renewed Song advances. After his death, the Song attempted and failed to reincorporate northern Vietnam into the Chinese Empire. Lê Hoan, Dinh Bo Lin's successor, defeated the poorly organized and shrunken Chinese military and obtained recognition from the Song dynasty as a local ruler and vassalage to the Song court. His success against the Chinese lay not only in the weakness of the Chinese military, but also through an alliance with Buddhist monks around the heavily populated region around Hanoi. He depended greatly on a supply of soldiers from that area. The Lý dynasty. After Lê Hoan's death, Lý Công Uan, the protege of the monks and commander of the palace guard, rose to power. In 1009, he founded the Lý dynasty and moved the capital to what is now Hanoi. The Lý dynasty had a series of strong military-minded rulers in the 11th century. They attacked the Cham capital in 1044 and 1069. In the 1070s, they started a conflict with the Song over control of the upland border populations. This resulted in a formal delineation of the border between Vietnam and China that has more or less been continued until contemporary times. The Lý royal clan dominated the region surrounding the capital and was allied with the local Buddhist monks. Power rested in its military authority, personal connections, and marriage politics. Rather than develop an administrative system, these were the tools used to create and maintain loyalty from the lesser clans who controlled the various areas beyond the capital. By the 12th century, internal rivalry led to the weakening of Lý authority. Kings sought to unify competing clans under its reign through marriage alliances rather than military action. But in 1226, one of these clans, the Tran, destroyed its rivals and founded a new dynasty. The Tran dynasty. The Tran dynasty signaled a shift in Vietnamese culture as they sought to eliminate weakness inherent in the former Lý government and develop closer ties with Song China. The Tran came from the coastal area near the mouth of the Red River and traced their ancestry to immigrants from the southeast coast of China. They represented a new kind of regime in Vietnam whose power rested on maritime trade and control of the rivers, which are the main means of communication and transport. While there is still no organized government bureaucracy, the Tran established a more centralized government by, first, only marrying within their own lineage, preventing other clans from gaining access to the court. Second, unifying the various localities by distributing them to members of the royal clan. Third, by designating heirs before the need arose. And fourth, initiating literary examinations for the recruitment of a new class of scholar officials. In the 13th century, the Mongols conquered the southern Song. The Tran viewed themselves as the last remaining guardians of the Hong Trong civilization and organized refugee Song armies with their own and successfully defended Vietnam from 2 Mongol invasions. This alliance coincided with the Trong religious and literary traditions that were more closely linked to the Trong and Song traditions than the Li. A new Buddhist sect, the Bamboo Forest, was founded in this period. In the middle of the 14th century, Mongol power had faded and the Trong dynasty began a period of decline. The royal princes maintained their authority but increasingly relied upon the growing number of educated commoners to handle the daily affairs of administration of the government. The scholar officials realized the need for reform, but the Buddhist kings they served did not. This led to peasant uprisings, and in the 1370s and 1380s, repeated invasions by the Cham king Chaebongna. Tran princes further retreated from the daily affairs of government, and Ho Wei Li took charge at court. Ho Wei Li and Ming rule. Ho Wei Li suppressed the Chams in 1390 and began to restore central authority and utilized scholar officials to institute a number of reforms. In 1400, he officially withdrew the Tran and declared his own dynasty. His reforms were a response to the crisis that coincided with the fall of the Tran dynasty, but many were quite radical and alienated much of the population. They also attracted criticism from the Ming dynasty. The Ming Emperor, Yongle, yearned to gain control of China's former southernmost province. Remaining members of the Tran clan made an alliance with Yongle, who sent Ming armies in 1407. Ho Wei Li was defeated, captured and exiled to China with his primary supporters. Ho Wei Li's rule had resulted in conflicting regional loyalties, which weakened the unity created by the earlier Tran government. The northern regions tended to support the Tran clan, who had originated from the Red River Plain and welcomed Ming rule as a return to peace, order, in former Han Tong times. Southern provinces tended to support Ho Wei Li. Assertion of Ming power meant the ascendancy of Confucianism, and many Buddhist temples were destroyed. The reincorporation of northern Vietnam into the Chinese Empire became a financial liability and administrative headaches for the Ming, who did not have practical use for the southern frontier beyond imperial pride. By the time of Yongluo's death in 1424, resistance to Ming policy in Vietnam had developed both from within the Ming government and from within the Vietnamese territories. Le Loi, from 1382 to 1432. Le Loi was a prominent local official from the southern provinces who had initially opposed Ming invasion, then served the Ming for several years before organizing resistance in 1418. In 1420, Guyen Tri, who lived from 1380 to 1442, joined Le Loi's uprising. An intellectual, Guyen Tri, refused to serve the Ming. Guyen Tri wrote letters citing Confucian texts to argue that Le Loi was the ruler sent by heaven to save Vietnam from the Ming in disorder. By 1425, Le Loi had gained control of the southern provinces, and in 1426 he was besieging Hanoi. Ming reinforcements were defeated in 1427, and remaining Ming forces evacuated the region in 1428. In that year, Le Loi founded the Le dynasty at Hanoi. The long era of confusion and failures in government that began in 1370 with the Cham invasions and continued through the controversy of Ho Wei Li's rule, and the Ming regime finally came to an end with the founding of the Le dynasty. The Li and Tran dynasties were very different in terms of how the royal clan and the court were organized, in the degree of centralized control over the kingdom, and in religious and literary culture. However, both were warrior aristocracies from the Red River Plain. Both ruled the same territories, and both were predominantly Buddhist. With the emergency of the Le dynasty, an age when Buddhist monks were prominent advisors at the court, and kings sought comfort in the sutras, was over. For the first time, a dynasty appeared that did not have its roots in the Red River Plain. This dynasty represented an alliance of military clans from the southern provinces that found the Confucian emphasis upon loyalty to the ruler, Public service and rational administration was more useful than Buddhist meditation, which had concentrated the martial spirits of the Li and Tran aristocracies. The ascendancy of Confucian scholar officials initiated a period of change in Vietnamese politics. Section 4. Southward expansion, regionalism, and civil wars. The Lê dynasty. Lê Loi died in 1433, killed along with his family by those of the Red River Plain that had viewed those of the southern province as rustic. Lê Tran Tong, from 1460 to 1497, Lê Loi's grandson, came to power. His success lay in these areas. First, the inclusion of the Confucian literati from the Red River Plain into the court. Second, establishing a bureaucratic form of government modeled after the Ming Dynasty, supporting the arts, literature, and education. And third, conquering of new territories beyond the southern frontier against the Chams, beginning the process of southward expansion. Lê Tran Tong instituted many reforms and encouraged writing, both historical and poetic. He commissioned a major history. Buddhism was banished as superstition. Ministries were created for 6 areas of government function. Provincial government was organized into civil, judicial, and military duties. Lê Tran Tong was an able ruler. His successes were largely personal. He led military expeditions into Laos. The southern coast was open to Vietnamese settlement. The dynasty began to collapse in the 16th century when a succession of incompetent and immature kings led to the rapid unraveling of the government. The Lê dynasty fell for want of competent leadership. The Mach dynasty. After many years of turmoil, during which regional animosities again came to the surface, the commander of the palace guard, Mach Dong Dung, proclaimed a new dynasty in 1527. The Mach dynasty was from the Red River Plain and understood the resentment among the people in the region toward the Lê reforms. The Mach also patronized Buddhism and popular religion, which had been discouraged by the Confucian administrators of the 15th century. Mach rule was well received in the Red River Plain of the north, but not in the southern provinces where allegiance to the Lê dynasty remained strong. In the 1530s, an anti-Mach alliance was formed by Tran Hua. Its most powerful clans were the Gayan and Trin. The alliance supported the claims of the Lê prince. The Ming army arrived to support the Lê pretensions, but the Mach negotiated its withdrawal. In the 1590s, the Mach failed to suppress southern armies and was forced out of the lowlands and into the northern provinces of Cao Bang, where they survived into the 1660s under the protection of the Ming dynasty. The Trin and Gayan families, after the successful suppression of the Mach, Gayan Huang and his nephew Tring Tong established their claims to separate sections of territory. From this period onward, the north and south developed separately. The Trin ruled the north from Hanoi, claiming the rule of the Lê. Gayan Huang returned to the south, ruling from modern-day Hue. He and his descendants ruled the south for 2 centuries and then, after gaining control of the north, would found the last dynasty in Vietnamese history. The Trin-Gayan Wars. The constant conflict in the 16th century stimulated migration into the southern Gayan region. This contributed to the formation of a new kind of Vietnamese identity that was less attached to tradition and more open to individual initiative and to contact with foreign peoples. The Northern Trin attempted to enforce the idea of a unified kingdom with a specific Vietnamese identity. They sent repeated expeditions into the south from the 1620s to the 1670s. The Southerners repulsed the expeditions and built a system of walls from the mountains to the sea. During the Trin-Gayan Wars, the rulers of both Vietnamese kingdoms opened ports for foreign merchants to import weapons and other manufactured goods. The North and the South each set up a city that was set aside for residences for foreign merchants. The Dutch favored the North and the Portuguese the South. At the end of the 17th century, the Trin abandoned their aggressive policy towards the South. European merchant communities in Tonkin exited as the government turned inward and lost interest in foreign trade. In the early 18th century, a series of peasant rebellions erupted. With the end of the Trinh attack, the Gaian continued concentrating on foreign trade and southward expansion. Through a series of alliances with the Khmer Kingdom and Ming refugees fleeing Manchu conquest of China, the Gaian acquired additional land south of its original territory. In the 1690s, Gaian conquered the last remaining Cham kingdom and moved its administrative headquarters to Saigon. Beset by the Siamese and the Vietnamese, the Khmer Kingdom lost much of its territory. By the mid-18th century, the Gaian had acquired all the territory that today makes up the Vietnamese provinces in the Mekong River Plain. The southern expansion led to a great pressure in the far south, leading to revolt. In the 1770s, the Tay Son Rebellion erupted in Binh Dinh as a reaction to Gaian control of the Mekong Plain. The rebellion included Vietnamese peasants, Chinese merchants, lowland Chams, and upland minority peoples. It turned into a 30-year war that included invasions from Siam and China. The conflict ended in 1802 with the unification of all Vietnamese-speaking territories under the leadership of Nguyen An, founder of the Gaian dynasty. The dynasty's capital was Hue, but viceroys governed from Hanoi and Saigon. In 1802, there appeared for the first time the country of Vietnam as we know it on a map today. The Gaian dynasty ruled for around 60 years before the French began their conquest. The first king, Nguyen An, reigned with the title of Emperor Gai Long from 1802 to 1819. Minh Mong from 1820 to 1840 was the dynasty's second king. He attempted to rule Cambodia, leading to war with Siam. His successor withdrew from Cambodia in the 1840s. Reforms included bureaucratic changes during the Qing dynasty. Minh Mong also began to target Christians, but this action led to French intervention. Section 5. Cultural Development and Relations with the West. Up until the 1100s, to be an educated Vietnamese meant to read classical Chinese. This changed when a new generation born at the turn of the 20th century was educated in French and in alphabetic vernacular. This resulted in cultural discontinuity described as an abrupt shift into modernity. Up until the 1400s, the elite wrote nearly always in classical Chinese. In the 1400s and the 1500s, vernacular poetry developed, encouraged by King Lê Thanh Tong and Nguyen Binh Kim, producing what are now considered classics. Nguyen Du, from 1765 to 1820, wrote a long verse novel, Kim Van Q, considered the greatest piece of Vietnamese literature. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Buddhism's dominance of Vietnam dissipated. Starting with the Moc and Lê, a Buddhist revival took place in the 1500s. Vietnamese Buddhism included cults of Tran Hong Dao, a general responsible for standing up to Mongol invasion, and elements of Confucianism, Taoism, and popular religion. In the South, Buddhism also incorporated Cham and Khmer culture and Theravada Buddhism. The period was one of both great experimentation and openness to outside influences. Christianity was influential and missionaries were successful throughout Vietnam. Jesuits brought not only religion but also scientific knowledge and devised an alphabet for Vietnamese. Extensive work in writing Christian literature in this alphabet has meant the study of Nam, the Vietnamese vernacular language, owes much to Christian writers. Nguyen An, in exile during the Tay Son Rebellion, sought assistance from the Chakri dynasty in Bangkok and sent an emissary to Paris for help. The French government did not respond, but the emissary sought volunteers to help Nguyen. Though no formal relationship was established, this development was later seen as important. Minh Man's persecutions of missionaries and Vietnamese Christians led to French naval officers stepping in at the request of the missionaries. The 1840s saw conflict in Vietnamese ports become the sites of conflict as French warships pushed the issue. These stirrings were not seen as a significant threat. The Gaian court at the time was more interested in keeping control over the regions governed by Hanoi and Saigon.